Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to be talking about this, the SIG P226 double action Kellerman. Now before we get too far into this handgun specifically and what a double action Kellerman is, I want to talk a little bit about a history of this firearm. So in the mid to late 80s, the Army decided that it wanted to replace the M1911 pistol and started the M9 handgun trials. This gun, the Beretta 92 FS, and a bunch of other handguns were entered into those trials. So it came down, at the end of the trials, it came down between the SIG P226 and the Beretta 92 FS. The guns were neck and neck, and apparently what it came down to was price as what got the Beretta 92 FS selected over the SIG P226. I'm not completely convinced it was just price. Something that is very specific about the SIG P226 is it does not have a safety. There's not a model in the double action, single action versions that has a safety, and for the Army that's always been kind of a major sticking point. Now a lot of people will say that you don't need a safety, that you're the safety, this is your safety, however it is that you want to talk about it. But when you're talking about a organization as large as the military with a wide number of backgrounds and a very diverse selection of firearms experience, it's generally accepted that you should default on the side of having a manual safety so that you can teach somebody and have a safeguard in case they didn't actually take the teaching very seriously, or their experience is not enough to actually keep them safe with the handgun. I don't believe that safeties make a gun safe. I believe that people make guns safe. However, I totally understand large organizations needing a little bit more of a guarantee. Now, for all I know, the SIG 226 that went up against the 92 FS had a safety on it. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I don't know. I also know that if you want more information about those trials, there's a lot of other places on YouTube you can go look. I would recommend Small Arms Solution. Mr. Bartocci over there just does a fantastic job talking about the Beretta and the M9 trials and all the stuff that's associated with them. It's a really good channel. If you haven't checked it out, take a look. They're very long videos, but they are very in-depth. Now, going from there, so this gun doesn't win the wider military contract. It doesn't get adopted by all four branches and all that kind of stuff. However, as a consolation prize, it does get selected by the Navy SEALs. And I think that's a pretty good consolation prize. You get selected, your handgun doesn't win the overall contract, but it still gets picked up by one of the most elite fighting forces the world has ever seen. I think I would feel pretty good about that. They probably wanted more money out of it, but they're not exactly hurting because this gun wound up getting adopted very widely by other militaries and by the United States police market. There were a lot of police departments that were looking for handguns at this time. So at this time, what you see, running into this time, what you see are a lot of police officers are still carrying revolvers, double action, single action revolvers. The 1911 and other semi-automatic pistols were out on the market. However, they were not very popular for a couple of different reasons. The 1911 kind of comes back to a safety concern. So the Series 70 1911s have a free-floating firing pin that, if dropped, can cause the firearm to discharge. They're also single-action guns, and a lot of police departments are very nervous about their officers having not exactly a hair trigger, but what is effectively a very short travel trigger that could potentially cause the situation to get a lot worse much faster than if the officer had something with a double action trigger, kind of like this gun. So you see a lot of guys running around with double action revolvers. Now I think a lot of that also has to do with there's not a lot of faith in handgun cartridges at the time, which is something that should still be prevalent today, but is not as prevalent as it should be. And so you see a lot of guys carrying 357 Magnums and 38 plus P revolvers, fairly hot cartridges for the day, so that they are man stoppers, so to speak. Now you also see them running around with double action guns, and the idea being that, yes, your revolver might be double action and the ability to cock the hammer for a single action trigger. However, the vast majority of your engagements are going to occur with double action fire. And the idea being that that officer has to really want to pull that trigger to send that round down range and start this engagement. As opposed to if he needs to, he can cock the hammer and take a very precise light trigger pull shot. Now you also see a lot of hammers on revolvers at this time bobbed, kind of like this one is here. You can see it's cut very short. And a lot of that has to do with A, making sure that the officer fires it in double action, but I think it's more predominant on B, which was it was easier to conceal. You didn't have the hammer getting caught on things. So you'll see that on a lot of snub noses and revolvers like that. Now, another thing that was keeping these guns from, sorry, I had to gather myself there for a second. Another thing that was keeping a lot of semi-automatics from getting adopted at the time was that they were just not that reliable. The 1911 has, we'll call it questionable reliability. I've seen 1911s run amazingly, and I've seen 1911s jam constantly. I've seen the full gambit of interactions with the 1911. But for a lot of your higher capacity 9mm handguns at the time, like your Smith & Wesson first and second generation pistols, that being the Model 39 or 59, and then also like the 459, the next generation pistols up, a lot of them were not terribly reliable. So they were not considered to be good replacements for revolvers. Now we get into the late 80s, you know, more and more handguns have been making their way onto the market. And we get into the late 80s and then into the 90s. Now we've got SIGs, we've got Berettas, and we've got Glock that just hit the country. So now we have a wide plethora of high capacity or higher capacity semi-automatic handguns that are also reliable. It's a golden time for the police market. So now these guys are going in and everyone's feeling the need to switch away from revolvers and move into semi-autos. Now, a lot of the guns that you're seeing are double action, single action guns. And the great thing about a double action gun is that first trigger pull is very long. So that officer has to want to take that shot. Now, the problem with that very long first trigger pull is that a lot of times it'll throw the shot. The untrained person that is a right-handed shooter, they will go left and about 3 inches low on their first shot with the double action, single action gun. Then it also throws a lot of people because the reset, after the slide cycles, it cocks that hammer, so now every shot afterwards is a single action trigger. Well, a lot of times that second round now, the first round single action, the second round fired out of the gun, will throw a lot of people because all of a sudden the travel was much shorter and it was a lighter trigger pull. So a lot of times you'll see guys pull the next shot. Now that's a training issue. And that's, again, we come back to things being a training issue, but when you're trying to train and arm a large group of people, that's time, that's money, and that may not be time or money that you have. So, there's, you know, a lot of people who like striker fires or single action only guns for that reason, but you do lose a lot of safety without that double action pull. So, you see, sorry guys, I keep losing my place, gotta look at my notes that I took for myself over here. So you see a couple other people try to take a different approach because a lot of times in these engagements, right, so the officer engages in his double action, single action gun. If he has a decocker, the training at the time is to make sure that he hits that decocker once his engagement's over, but he's still scanning his sector so that his gun is now back to a more safe condition that he can still operate from. And I would see this with the M9 up until its replacement in the Army. We were trained that when you were done with your engagement, you were supposed to be decocking the gun and then returning it to the holster. But you decocked it while you were still scanning for threats. And then you brought it back to your holster. And it definitely had better be decocked before you brought it back to your holster. It's a great way to get hit in the back of the head. So now, SIG comes up with the double action Kellerman. So the idea, and you see this in about 2002-2004 time frame, was that you have a long double action trigger pull, right? And then you'll notice that this gun has, listen, 2 resets. Why is that? We'll get into that right now. So I take my long double action trigger pull first, slide cycles, and then I bring it out to my first reset, which then gives me a short but still double action only trigger pull. And the idea was that an officer in a shot string would have his long initial pull, and then he would be able to continue his shot string with a shorter travel trigger so that he could keep stacking those rounds on top of each other and finish out his engagement. And then, when he was done shooting at whatever he was shooting at, he could let the trigger all the way out. The action of removing his finger from the trigger guard brought him back to a safer condition for his handgun. So he could ride the reset, string, fire however rounds it took to neutralize the target, and then as he got his finger straight again, like he was supposed to in order to be able to scan for any additional threats, the gun returned to double action. Kind of a genius setup, honestly. There's no additional levers or anything that I have to train someone to be able to manipulate and all that kind of stuff. I can, improve my chances of not having unsafe behaviors like someone attempting to return a cocked handgun to their holster without first making sure they dropped that hammer or removed that or brought the trigger back out to double action. So you'll see a couple other manufacturers do the same kind of thing with varying results. We'll talk about those a little bit more at the end. For right now, though, I want to talk about this pistol specifically. So I picked this gun up used. It is a police trade-in found at my local gun shop. Sitting on top, I have some tritium night sights. When I was looking at them in the gun store, I was attempting to cup my hand over them so I could gauge how much life was left in these tritium night sights. And not that it bothered me. So the vast majority of night sights have about an 8-year shelf life before they're very dim and almost useless. And that also coincidentally happens to coincide with when most police departments seem to want to trade out their guns. So most of the time when I see a police trade-in gun, I don't expect the night sights to have much life left in them. And that was something that I used to be able to negotiate the price on this particular pistol. However, I got it home, and as it turns out, these night sights work fantastic, and because of that, it's now become my bedside gun. I have another handgun with phosphorescent night sights. However, you have to recharge them with a light source. So in the middle of the night, if something goes bump and I have to go check it out, do my husbandly duties about the house and scan for threats, it's nice that I don't have to first hit my night sights with a flashlight before I can start going to work. So as soon as I wake up at night, I can see these things, glowing in the dark, and that gives me a lot of faith in the pistol. Moving down from there, we see that we have a stainless steel slide sitting on top of an alloy frame, and that we have the stainless coloring as well. It's a two-tone gun, which again was popular, it seems, in the 90s and early 2000s, but has definitely fallen out of popularity now. You'll also notice that there's a lot of holster wear on this gun. This gun came in and out of somebody's doo-doo holster quite frequently. You'll notice that SIG in general has a very high bore axis, and this is very common across literally everything SIG makes except for like the 238 and the 938. The M17 is just as indicative of the same type of thing. And you would think that with this much material above the center line of your hand that the gun would be very flippy under recoil, but it's actually not true, and I think a lot of that has to do with spring tension. Now, it does give this gun a very weird recoil though still, so it's not necessarily that it's flippy, it's that it's very kerchunk. Now, 45s like 1911s have a very kerchunk type of recoil, but this is almost like kerchunk in a vise. So the initial movement of the slide is very quick and light, but then there's a noticeable, very short, but noticeable hesitation before the full slide comes to the rear. And you can really feel that when shooting it. It stood out to me in pretty much everything that SIG makes with this high bore axis on it. I noticed it in the M17. I noticed it in the SIG 229, and I definitely noticed it here in the 226. Now, is it unsettling? Does it make it difficult to shoot the firearm? No, it's just something that I noticed and I thought I should let you know about. Now, I have a 4.4-inch barrel and a Browning tilting cam system, which is very common in most of your super successful handguns these days. The gun itself in 40 Smith & Wesson, which is what this is, weighs 34 ounces. The 9mm weighs 32 ounces. Coming back to here, you'll see that I have a pick rail, which is not terribly common on the older SIG pistols, especially like the gun that went in for military trials, did not have a pick rail on it. That was not a common thing at the time. And it's something that's become much more standard in recent years. I actually have a friend of mine who has a gun of similar vintage, a SIG 229, that does not have a pick rail on it, and he's pretty jealous of mine because he would really like to mount a light on his gun. At this point, I haven't picked out a light for this gun yet. I do have one that's in service on actually a pistol light that's sitting on a rifle right now, that as soon as I upgrade the light that I want on that rifle, I will move it over to this gun. That just hasn't happened yet. Coming back to here, we have a squared trigger guard with serrations cut into it. This is indicative of a method of shooting that used to be trained quite commonly, but I don't see too often anymore, which was to grip the front of the trigger guard, which is why people liked flat trigger guards. Like I said, it doesn't seem to be very popular. Most people, myself included, have gone to a thumbs forward type of shooting grip, which precludes having to grab onto the front of the trigger guard, but to each their own. You know, if somebody shoots that really well, I don't see a reason for them to have to change it. We then have our double action and slightly shorter double action trigger, moving back to there. Here we have our grip, which has serrations cut in the front of it. It has the plastic pebbled grips, very common for this vintage of firearm, and that they are wrap around, they go away to the back. It has a toe at the base of the pistol, which I actually find rather irritating. And a lot of that, once again, has to do, I think, with my grip and then also my hand size, to where I have a tendency, the idea of this toe is supposed to be to kind of cradle and funnel your grip in a specific manner. But what it winds up doing for me is it actually gives me something to kink against under recoil, and that will sometimes cause me to dip the muzzle while firing. So I have to remind myself to kind of keep these fingers a little more loose while I'm shooting so that I don't have that kind of anticipation type result under recoil. You also note that the grips themselves kind of mushroom out at the top. They are contoured to be able to kind of cradle or channel against your hand so that you can lock the pistol in pretty well. The pebbling I don't find to be very grippy. It's actually very benign, and I would not, this is not the grippiest texturing I've ever felt on a handgun, that is for sure. And then also, if you do have a SIG 226 in general, keep an eye on these screws. They do have a tendency to want to walk out. I finally put a little super glue on them just to keep them in place. Just a small amount, just enough to give it a little bit of tension. We also have a reversible magazine release in the standard kind of American setup instead of one of those European style heel release. And a 12 round capacity magazine in the 40 Smith & Wesson and a 15 round capacity in the 9mm. These guns also come with 357 SIG, which shares all the same data as the 40 Smith & Wesson. Now, I consider this magazine to be a huge flaw in this gun. A gun this size, weighing this much, should hold 15 rounds. When you consider a Glock 22 weighs 11 ounces less than this and holds 3 more rounds in a flush fit magazine, that blows my mind. It seems like every other European manufacturer has never been able to figure out fitting 15 rounds into a full-size handgun like Glock has. Heckler & Koch and Walther are just as guilty of this. All of their 40 Smith & Wesson guns are, in my opinion, carrying too little rounds in a flush fit magazine. This is the same capacity as a SIG P229. That's a smaller gun and both hold 12 rounds. How does that work out? That doesn't make any sense. You can get 14 and 15 round capacity SIG 226 magazines, but they have extended base plates. Why can I not have a 15 round flush fit? All right, rant complete. Now you also find at the end of this gun, at the heel of the butt, you'll find a lanyard loop. American police have never been that big on lanyard loops, but a lot of European countries have been, so it seems like that is why it was included. Moving up, we have a well-placed slide release if you use slide releases. I am not a big fan of using a slide release as a slide release. I prefer to use it as a slide catch. I use those terms interchangeably, however, because I embrace the fact that some people each their own. I don't really get in that debate. I shoot a lot of different types of handguns with slide releases in different places, so to me it doesn't make any sense to run them. I just over-the-top rack my handguns. Some guys, you know, I cannot argue with them that this is faster. So some people, they're really caught up on that. They want the gun back into action as fast as they can, and they like hitting the slide release. That's fine. Now, something else I have noticed is that because of my grip and how it lines up on the gun, it has a tendency to make this not act like a slide catch. So what I found that I have to do is modify my grip and wrap my thumb onto my other thumb so that the slide catch will actually do its job. Now, under stress or when I'm, you know, trying to move quickly or just get rounds on target and all that kind of stuff, I have a tendency to just wind up riding it, and that means that I don't get last shot hold open on the pistol. It's mildly irritating. But once again, if you actually use this, then it could be useful, but if you're using a thumb forward grip, you're probably still not going to get any utility out of it. Now, something that you used to see was that people would cross their thumbs. That was something that was commonly taught once upon a time, and that does keep your thumbs clear of the slide catch. However, I don't find this to be as secure a grip, and I don't use it, and I don't even see anybody advocate for that type of shooting anymore. Coming to the rear of the pistol, we have a very abbreviated beaver tail, which is something indicative, once again, of the older models. And then we also have this bobbed hammer in the rear. So this cannot be cocked for single action at all. It doesn't work that way. It is only a double action gun. And those are pretty much our features. Now, I did take this out to the range. There's one little issue with my range footage though, and it's pretty difficult for me to try to get range footage as it is. All I have to shoot at are public lands, so I kind of have to find a time when I can have enough space to be able to set up, you know, cameras and all that kind of stuff and do multiple takes. And unfortunately, in my multiple takes, I didn't wind up getting good audio. You can hear the gunshots, you can hear everyone else's gunshots, but you can't really hear me speak. So, how it starts out in the video, let's go ahead and summarize it real quick, and then I'll show it to you. So I start out going full double action only. And something to keep in mind before we go too much further into this is that the first trigger pull on this, that full long double action trigger pull, is 6 pounds. The reset trigger pull, there's my first reset, my reset trigger pull, though shorter, is 8 pounds. Now the 6 pound double action trigger feels great. It feels like it's on rollers. It's very smooth, it's straight to the back, it feels really good. But that 8 pound reset trigger pull is actually a lot of stacking, very aggressive stacking, because it's a lot of weight in a shorter overall distance. I can't stand this reset trigger. I love the long 6 pound trigger pull. Now, for my shooting footage, I start out with shooting only in double action for the first couple of rounds and letting the gun come all the way out past both clicks to the full reset of the 6 pound trigger pull. Then you'll see me look back over my shoulder and say something into my shoulder, but it doesn't actually make it to the speaker on the camera. And I then fire just in single action, or the reset 8 pound trigger pull, and fire a couple of rounds that way. Then after that, you'll see me speak over my shoulder again, and then I start shooting, and that is I'm going through a full travel of the trigger. So I'm bringing it, and I'm getting that reset trigger, and I'm shooting it until there's no more rounds left to shoot. And then, of course, I don't get slide lock. Spoiler alert, I don't get slide lock at the end of it. So, let's go ahead and take a look at that footage. All right, guys, Murph's here. Today we're going to be going over the double action Kellerman on the range. So, what we're going to do first, we're going to start off, I'm going to try to really exaggerate the resets and that kind of stuff so that you guys get a good feel for what's going on with that reset on the trigger. I'm going to start out, I'll fire it just completely in double action, a couple of rounds, then I'll start getting to that reset, and I'll delineate to you when I do that. So follow along with me. All right, so now I'm going to hold it at that first set. You heard the click, I hope. All right, so then a full fire string, I don't know how many rounds I have left, but a full fire string would look like this.
Once again, it did not lock on an empty chamber.
All right, cool guys. So that was it shooting. How does it shoot? Well, it's taken some getting used to. Recoil impulse being the first thing you have to get used to, but then also the trigger itself. So like when I first took it to the range, I was having a lot of issue where I was tipping the barrel down and I was throwing shots low. Now eventually I kind of figured out this toe thing, and I've been keeping these fingers. And this is a pretty common issue for me anyway. I have a tendency to put too much pressure on the bottom of the gun. So it's already something that I have to kind of remind myself of to begin with, to make sure to keep these bottom fingers loose when I'm shooting. However, out of 300 rounds, the gun has proven to be very consistent, very accurate, well, accurate enough, I guess I should say, and 100% reliable. And that's what it really comes down to for these police trade-in pistols. I got this for right around 400. I'm pretty sure a little under, but it's been a while since I bought it. And it runs great. Yeah, it has some wear and tear, and it's not new by any means. It's no doubt has hundreds, if not thousands, of rounds put through it. But the gun works great. Now, I believe I mentioned before that this is chambered for the 40 Smith & Wesson, which I don't mind keeping 40 Smith & Wesson around, because when we have ammo rushes like we do right now, 40 Smith & Wesson hangs around a little bit longer than everything else does. So I like having 40 Smith & Wesson option guns available to me. Also, I've had a lot of friends trading in their 40 Smith & Wesson guns lately, which has meant that they've been willing to part with their ammunition. So I've been picking up ammunition pretty regularly for a while for 40 Smith & Wesson. I've got a lot of it lying around. Now, where does this gun fit into, though? This is not a concealed carry gun, I don't think. I think this would make a fine truck gun, especially since you're not going to pay that much for it. And you don't necessarily worry about it getting stolen, but it's also a worthy, reliable gun as opposed to keeping a high point in the truck. I use it presently as a bedside gun. So it sits on my nightstand, and if anything goes bump in the night, this is what I go investigate with. And I think that is where it really shines. I think it's a little old and had a lot of rounds through it to try to use it as a service pistol, but if you needed to for whatever type of work that you're doing that requires you to have a duty type gun, this is a duty size pistol and would do that, would continue to do that role very well. It's what it came out of. That's what this was made for. These guns, the SIG 226 specifically, was adopted by the US Coast Guard and a whole bunch of other police units. The SIG 229 in a double action Kellerman was adopted by air marshals for use on airplanes. So these guns are out there. They've been used quite a bit. Now, SIG no longer offers a double action Kellerman. I mentioned I was going to talk about some other people who did similar things. So Smith & Wesson did a double action gun in which the first round was double action. It was double action, single action gun, but the hammer was bobbed. And that's interesting, but it doesn't quite do the same thing this does. Now, Heckler & Koch has their LEM trigger, which actually, yes, the first round is double action, but your subsequent rounds feel more like a single action trigger. It's a much better gun. I have a friend of mine who has a P30L, and it is much better to shoot. I can shoot it far more easily than I can shoot this. 100% honest. But I have to say that one of the primary roles this gun plays for me is training strange. Now, what does that mean, Murph? Well, what that means is that this gun functions completely different from anything else I have. So it's a really great tool for me to use to train, to make sure that I'm keeping my brain engaged in what it is that I'm doing. There's, an old adage that says, beware the man with one gun. He probably can shoot it really well. I don't disagree with it, but when it comes to being a well-rounded practitioner of the shooting arts, you got to have more than one gun, and you got to be proficient in more than one style. So that is why I, first off, shoot a lot of different guns and a lot of different shooting disciplines and competitions and such like that, but also why I keep this guy around. I could sit there and sure, I could get really, really good with a single action trigger or a striker fired gun. But to me, it is more important to be able to handle multiple platforms really, really well. So that's where this guy comes in. So, if you come across this for a good price on a police trade-in, or really any police trade-in gun, honestly, I would 100% endorse you getting it. especially if you're kind of cash-strapped, but you want something that still works, is still very reliable and available for parts and all that kind of stuff. This is a fantastic choice to have to remain armed for not that much money. All right, guys, that's pretty much what I got for today. So I will catch you later.